I'm chatting today with Steve Vallis, who's the, you're a bit more than a barman. You actually own the Honey Bar in South Melbourne.
I do.
And you work here as well.
as little as possible.
And you're a friend to a lot of people on social media as well. So I'd love to just have a bit of a chat today, Steve, about what the Honey Bar and you personally is doing on social media and how you've found using Twitter and Facebook, etc. How has that helped build your business? So I'll start with the question, has it helped build your business? Do you like using social media?
I'm obsessed with social media. It has underpinned the business in a way that I wouldn't have expected when we opened the front doors.
So underpinned how?
It's allowed me to build a really strong base. I had a conversation with someone the other day about the fact that hospitality, in my view, the traditional model is a little bit broken. That unless you have a mechanism by which you do things a little bit differently than your average hospitality person nowadays, the likelihood is you'll be open and shut in a very short period of time. So the social media side's allowed me to build a community around the business that's constantly talking about the business, constantly bringing in business, and ultimately benefiting from the business and what I can offer them.
So it's a pretty tough industry, as we know, hospitality. You know, your competition is everywhere, but it's not just other restaurants and cafes and bars, but it's anything that takes people's time because it's often a leisure activity.
I've said that for a long time that discretionary spend now is my competition. It's not the case as it was a few years back where people just try to make a decision about whether they go to a bar or to a restaurant, because the last couple of years have been very difficult financially for a lot of people. I think that the decision making ends up being, do I go to a bar, do I go to a restaurant, or do I go to the movies, or do I go away? And it's not quite the same as it was a few years back.
So let's go back to that, building a sense of community around the brand, or what I like to call a village of support. One thing I think the Honey Bar has done is galvanise quite a big following, so it's almost like a home away from home for a lot of people. But even those that don't live in the area but know you through social media, given that you're in a geographic location, but your community is spread right across Melbourne, how has social media helped you do that?
It's been a gradual process. We found, ironically, that the greatest support comes from further afield than our local community. Traditionally, you open up a business like this and it is the locals that come through and support you the most, but social's allowed me to build geographically a community that extends well beyond the kilometres around us. I started very early on. Chatting to people late at night was one of the original ways to get attention and to also amuse myself. So by nature, I'm a late night person. Not a lot of people necessarily awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, but social allowed me to see people who are awake and talk to them and very quickly establish a relationship and some rapport with people. Because
I suppose Twitter, we particularly with the locals, if there's not too many, it's you do get to know each other pretty well.
You do, and
a lot of insomniacs as clients, as customers.
Absolutely, and outside the customers, people are just grateful to have someone to talk to. So there's been a bit of a running gag that we have the Insomnia Club late at night. Depending on who's up, there'll be a quick conversation about what's keeping you up, what's caused it, when it's likely to be alleviated, and people sort of drop in and drop out of this little community late at night. And initially that was what built some conversation around the business, because people would wake up the next morning and be grateful that there'd been someone there to have a conversation with late at night. And
so with social media too, you're in a bar, it's about hospitality, it's about having an ear to listen to people, chatting, and so you've taken that bar experience, like Cheers, you've taken that online.
Pretty much. I mean, and this is the thing that lost on a lot of people who don't get social. Whenever you have a question where people, more the statement that people make that is, I don't care what someone had for breakfast, I always say that I do, because breakfast is often part of a continuing story. Breakfast is related to the fact that you went out last night, you didn't get home till very late, and you went out possibly because you got a job promotion, or you lost a job, or you're in a new relationship. That allows me to get some context about where people are, so you can really build relationships with people when you know that they're having good days, bad days, great months, and a greater understanding of what's sort of motivating them, what may or may not bring them to the bar, and whether or not they come to the bar often is irrelevant, because some of our biggest advocates have never been to the bar.
So there's the thing, you're building not just, whereas a lot of people who are probably running a bar and who are on social, their whole goal is, we want to get people to the bar and we're using Twitter to get people to that bar, whereas that's great if they do come to your establishment, but you're just as happy to turn people into fans and advocates who in turn will promote you or promote the Honey Bar because they like you.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I like to be entertained. So a lot of the relationships that we've built, they don't have any sort of real connection with the bar necessarily. They are personal interests that allow me to have a conversation, and it's always the case. It's a bit of a daisy chain. People will talk to people, and you ultimately get that support for the business without necessarily having to go out there and build it really aggressively. It's a question of what your outcome is, and what outcome you're looking to get. And if the outcome starts with, I want to get them in here drinking, then chances are what you produce and the sorts of conversations you have are very one-dimensional. So I start instead on the premise which you regularly tell the world you've got to add some value to people, and whether the value is a conversation late at night or whether the value is the space that I can offer or an introduction that I can potentially do, it comes in many sorts of different forms. The value is the key proposition.
So in terms of the social channels, Twitter is probably your mainstay. You've been on Twitter for a long time. Facebook continues to build, and you've recently, or when I say recently, in more recent times, taken to blogging. Can you walk us through what's your daily habit like with Twitter?
The Twitter stuff has been the most consistent over an extended period of time, and I took to it very early on, as I said, because personally I enjoyed it. It's become my primary news source, so I go to it to keep myself entertained, and it's also where all the conversations about all these topics are happening as well. So there isn't a day that goes by effectively in a 365-day year that I'm not tweeting, and part of that is because I am looking for conversation. Sometimes it's because I'm looking for amusement, but it's something I've done very consistently. I describe it often as my version of exercise. I do it every day, regardless of whether I want to sometimes, but most of the time it's a pretty easy thing to get involved with. But the consistency of doing it is what builds stronger relationships, I think, because people don't notice if you're not there. That's what I've found. Even when I go away, and I've been away on a couple of holidays in the last couple of years, I kept tweeting because the stream of conversation and information just will keep on going by. If you don't participate, you're not part of it.
And so you're quite active on Twitter, but your promotional element, I would say, is around 10%, maybe a tad over, but you're not very promotional, and you find that works for you?
It works incredibly well. You don't want to be selling. Every time I see new accounts that are being opened by businesses, whether hospitality or otherwise, if I look at an account and I see that they are talking about the business itself a lot to begin with, it's a bad start for most businesses, because the truth is it's not that interesting. And I know with this business, I sell a product for the most part that's not easily differentiated, is easily differentiated with respect to, you've got many options to take. You can be at 1 million bars across Melbourne. I still sell a beer behind the bar. There's not a huge difference. So I recognise that the conversation, the relationship is what's going to distinguish me, not the product I'm selling. So if you are in the business of just selling a widget, then the truth is widgets aren't that interesting, but there might be something about the business or about the individual who's selling it that could be more interesting than the product itself. So
I've always thought that Twitter is probably still the last remaining real social network, whereas Facebook now is pretty much just a media channel. How are you, with the way that the changes to the Facebook algorithm, etc., how are you you've been on Facebook for a while, how are you adjusting to the new Facebook?
I think I'm a big advocate of Facebook for a lot of businesses. I think if you're selling on Facebook or selling products potentially in an online type business, Facebook is a great channel, but it is becoming increasingly, and I think will continue to become, a pay-to-play channel. It was the case that you could put material up, it wasn't that crowded marketplace, people were likely to see it, there was a reasonable amount of reach. The thing that I've changed about the way I approach Facebook now is there's much more original content. I'm much more deliberate about when I think I'm posting, and again, from my point of view, I monitor what other people are doing as well, and recognise that if you're doing what everyone else is doing, you're less likely to get traction. Facebook wants to give people interesting content. As much as people don't like a lot of the things that Facebook's doing, they want to remain relevant, and they're doing their best to make sure that the most relevant, most interesting content moves through the stream.
So you're more strategic now with Facebook than you would be with, say, Twitter?
Absolutely.
In terms of your content?
No, I aim, because I just recognise that if I have to get past the gatekeeper. For Twitter, I can say whatever I want, whenever I want, and if it's interesting, by my reckoning or by my community's reckoning, they're likely to see it if they happen to be paying attention. Whereas Facebook makes a decision via the algorithm, which is constantly being tweaked, obviously, whether or not they want the people that I'm engaging with or I'd like to engage with to see it. And they've also, of course, more obviously in recent times said, we'll let you get to them, but you've got to pay to do it. And I recognise that. That's not an unreasonable request, I think, a lot of the time, because they're running a business, and if the cost is not prohibitive and the return on investment you can get is reasonable, then there's a cost to be paid.
So what about, are you on Google Plus, given you're in a physical location?
I am on Google Plus. I don't do a huge amount of Google Plus. I've claimed my place page. I make sure that there's content on the place page. I monitor reviews on Google Plus over a period of time, recognising that Google is likely to pay attention from a ranking point of view to all these indicators as they're sort of distributed across the web, across a variety of different websites. It's something, again, from my point of view, because I am doing all the content related to the business, I'm mindful that I just can't spread myself too thinly, and I'm also mindful that I'm respectful to the channels that I'm on. So if I'm on Google Plus or I'm on Facebook or I'm on Twitter, what I'm trying to avoid doing is sending out the same message across all three channels, because I just think it's a lazier way. You don't build stronger communities necessarily by doing that. And from my point of view, I figure if you are seeing me say the same thing on multiple channels, then I'm less likely to be able to grow a community.
And you've recently taken to blogging. What was that about? Why you? Is it an experiment? Did you do research before it? What's your thinking behind having a blog?
I recognised how important it was a long time ago, because the other platforms that I work with, Twitter included, as much as I love it, Twitter is, I'm renting someone else's land effectively as far as the business goes. All roads should ultimately lead to the website, and I did not start that way. Twitter was a lot easier for me to build a relationship and community in. The website required more work to get to a point that I wanted it to be, but once I felt that it was in reasonable shape, then I've started to invest more time in doing it. So I'm much more mindful now that I want people to come back to the website, and that's a work in progress for me at the moment. One of the ways to get attention to the website is to be creating original content relatively regularly on there, so that Google visits the website relatively regularly, and also the people who deal with me, meet me, or want to get a sense of what the business is will go to the website as a primary source of information.
And it gives, so you've built your community through social channels, now you're starting to overlay with the blog, and therefore the relationships you have with people through social are happy to share your blog posts, which goes out further and also drives traffic back to the website.
Absolutely. And it's funny that people get a real sense of the business, but they also get a sense of involvement in the business. I've had a few people that say to me it's the closest they'll ever be to owning a bar, which is probably a good thing for most people, because owning a bar sometimes isn't the dream that you think it's going to be, but they get to involve themselves in the stories, and they're able to read some of the things that I posted and recognise themselves in there and know that they've been a part of the story and the community that's represented in the blog post.
So tell me about the blogging. Let's stick to that for the moment. Very, very strong on storytelling and lessons learned and yarns and anecdotes. Is that just a natural thing to you, or did you think about doing it that way? Or because, I mean, it's not like, I mean, if you're a lawyer, you can speak about legal issues and things like that. If you're an accountant, you can talk about tax time. Sometimes you'd think it might be a little bit harder for a bar, but really what you're doing is you're not necessarily talking about functions and things you got going. You're actually talking about the people who come in and out of your life, and the bar is really a backdrop to the stories that you tell.
It has been a process getting a voice or sort of building up the stories in my own head, but that was the premise upon which the business was built. I mean, we called the place Honey, and the name itself was not meant to be representative of bees and the normal buzz sort of view. It was honey in a language sense. Our t-shirts, our uniforms say honey, I'm home. The staff have been wearing them since day one, and it's meant to be, we're meant to be part of the story, we're not meant to be the story. So the blog was always going to be that sort of a direction for us, which was sharing that part of the business, recognising that the people of the business are more interesting than the business itself.
You tell one particular story about an elderly couple, isn't it, who came in and they wanted to dance. What was the story there?
Yeah,
This is just a great example of the sort of thing that you're blogging about.
It was it was early on in the piece, when I opened up the business and I swung the doors open, expected people just to charge through the door, as most prospective business owners do. And there were some long, quiet nights early on, particularly early in the week. I had a couple that came in downstairs who were obviously very religious, very conservative, who had never seen them before. I had the husband come up to me and ask me whether or not he could dance with his wife to a particular song, and asked me whether or not he'd mind if I made sure no one interrupted them and no one saw them when they did it. So I offered them the space upstairs. There was virtually no one in the venue anyway, and I made sure that downstairs was blocked off at the bottom so no one could accidentally wander in. Chose the song or played the song that they asked me to play. They obviously came upstairs. They would have danced for 5 or 10 minutes. I made a point of not watching any cameras and peeking and anything. I just knew that was a moment they wanted to share themselves. They came downstairs, they finished their drinks, they said thanks, and I've never seen them again. But the memory stuck with me. So when I was thinking about blog topics, it's an odd thing, the things that will bubble to the surface. But that story, it struck me as a nice contribution, a moment in time for them, and it was something that I took away as a really important sort of part of the business.
And also a lesson learned. Lessons from those stories that stick in your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And the lessons I recognise are that where you are in your life is important to what this business is. I wrote another post where I talked about some incredible support that I get. When I'm feeling flat, in particular when I need help, I ask for this community to help me because they've recognised them for what they are, which is they're my friends. It's not a bar-centric relationship anymore. I leave the bar and spend a lot of time with people I've met here, who I didn't know before I opened the business. Off-site, I've travelled into the state with people, I've travelled overseas with people, I go to sporting events, I go to all sorts of things, and I get that enjoyment as well, which is sharing in other people's lives.
So blurring of lines between professional and personal.
It is a blurring of lines, and I'm lucky in a key respect, which is I often say to people, I don't spend time with people I don't like. It's the way I try to live my life, and the business allows me to do that because my friends who are supporters of the business, they facilitate that as well. The more time I can spend with people I do like, they tend to naturally support the business. So it's a bit self-fulfilling as a prophecy. So it seems to be the case that a lot of the community, a lot of the people who've become really engaged with the business, it's a bit of a self-excluding sort of group now. We have a lot of people who want to mix with people they've been introduced to in this business, and they tend to attract like. So it's nice watching that and being a part of it.
One thing you've been very good at doing early on around the social media digital space is that you reached out to the digital community who obviously were online and talking, and they had events here, they came here, they tweeted that they were here, they took photos, Instagram. Foursquare has been probably really good for you.
Yep.
That's obviously worked for you and been the basis of your community moving forward, but you've recognised that people, as an author Brian Solar says, people have got an audience of audiences of audiences. And so that ripple effect has probably been quite good in getting the name of the Honey Bar out there.
People have been very generous as well. Early on, clearly there's been some conversation where once they pass the test, which is, do I like what they're saying, are they interesting, would I like to engage with them? Once that box is ticked, they've been very generous in terms of pushing the business forward, and there's some people early on in particular, and Kate Kendall was one. Kate's got a strong following in Melbourne, and she was supportive very early, and it gave the business some credibility in terms of what I was trying to do. I had a customer once who ultimately became a friend, who said to one of my staff, I'm not buying this, I know this is some sort of a campaign being run by an agency. And my staff member said, there's no campaign, there's a guy sitting there at 2 o'clock in the morning tweeting crap to people. Do you think we're paying him to do that? And he said, no, I don't believe it. But sure enough, came to realise that it was me doing it.
Genuine.
And this was someone who was in digital, this was someone who was in marketing, who then spread the word and said, no, this is a guy that's doing this and he works really hard on it and he really enjoys it. And he commits to building a knowledge base week after week and month after month.
So where we are at the moment is your sort of event space, and obviously when you run a bar and you've got an event space, that's a good revenue raiser. How important has social media been in terms of getting this place booked? Forget downstairs where people can come and drink and eat, but as a venue that people can come and book events, how important has social been to help with that side of things?
It's been critical to it. I think the general reliance that venues have on a very limited selection of events, engagements, weddings, 21st birthdays, 30th and the like, we've been able to expand much more beyond that by allowing people to run all sorts of events here, because they have recognised the voice or seen us on one of the channels. So networking in particular is something we really support. I try to help people build their own communities, and I facilitate it by saying, here's the space, and then modify offers to make sure that it can happen. So simple example is if people don't have budgets, I might say do it on a Monday night or do it on a Tuesday night. It's less likely to otherwise be booked. It's easy for me to offer the space. If they want something on a Thursday or a Friday, there might be a budget involved, but I try to give people some value in sort of doing it. But there's been a recognition that I've been trying hard to help other people in that regard, so it feeds itself. So it's very unusual for us to go a single week without an event that I can tie directly back to the social channels. Even this year, they've probably been, we're only 3 or 4 months in, and I think I've probably already had 40 or 50 events that I can specifically tie back to either Twitter or Facebook, or a relationship that's been built on the back of that.
That is, when people want ROI, the old ROI, mate, that's how do you just know it's working. You don't need to sort of put a mathematical equation to it from that perspective.
It's funny because I talked to a friend who is in social and digital. He said, why don't you jump off for a week or two and see if it affects your business? I said to him, I have no doubt whatsoever that it affects my business. I know how much of my business is being driven by the people who are supportive and the people who are talking about us all the time. So,
as you say, momentum, and being visible and having momentum, and continually nurturing, cultivating the relationships and the community that you have.
And I think early on, one of the challenges that a lot of businesses face is they play a very short game, and understanding that if you do things early on and you have success doing them, then often it's going to be viewed in a very mercenary fashion. So I have now the benefit of an extended period of time, and whether it's the blogging or the 20-odd thousand tweets that I've done, and all the Facebook posts, that people recognise, absolutely I'm running a business, but I look to reward those who support my business, and whether that's reward by establishing friendships, whether it's reward by giving them a space at a rate that no one else is going to offer it, whatever it's going to be, no one thinks it's a mercenary approach, because it isn't, because there's a lot that I put back in and a lot that I get tremendous personal satisfaction from.
So where to now in terms of your social media marketing? Is it just continuing to build on what you've got? Is there any apps, tools, platforms out there that you see that might be interesting, you might experiment with?
I think what I've come to realise, I'm not quite hitting the wall yet. Everyone's busy in terms of their day-to-day life. Because I enjoy doing a lot of the social stuff, and I enjoy creating the content that people find amusing, whether it's a funny comment, whether it's an image that I'm working with. It's just committing more and more time is my issue at the moment. It's making sure that the business doesn't get in the way of the social, as opposed to the social getting in the way of the business. So across those channels, the Facebook stuff I do enjoy. I enjoy the challenge of Facebook and trying to better and game the system to a degree.
And the content. And
the content that is now recognising that if I create the good content, I'm playing against people who build content daily, and that for me is a bit of a motivation. Is their content getting better reach than mine? I think I can be more amusing, or I think I'd like to try something that they haven't tried. The alternative platforms that are sort of emerging as well, the Instagram stuff works for a lot of businesses. I think in hospitality, I think it works particularly when it comes to the visual depiction of food and drink, how that fits in to the business. I haven't overreached on Instagram to this point in time. Whether or not Snapchat might be a platform that works in the future. Some businesses, I think, are trying to do some interesting things on Snapchat and trying to be first to market effectively. But I'm keeping an eye on a lot of things that are being developed and seeing whether or not I can add them into the business at the moment, whilst I remain the primary creator of the content. What I'd like to do ideally, obviously, is I'd like to be working with people who are sharing the same experience. I am immersing myself constantly in industries that are inspiring personally, and the things I really like are, I like tech industries, I like all the geeky industries out there where people are building something from nothing. That's what drives me. So the business for me, if it works well, allows me to facilitate that side of the dream.
And what's some advice for a small business? So, they've got a few employees running everything themselves, having to do everything, and they say, well, I haven't got the time, or they're just going in and trying to, get the quickest result possible using social. What sort of advice from everything that you've been doing and the results you've got and the results that you're seeing and the experimentation, what can you advise other businesses?
I think the two obvious things, you go to a lot of events and you speak to a lot of people that talk about some of the fundamentals. The first one is have a real understanding of what your voice is, because what you'll find if you jump in too early into any of these platforms, it will potentially sound disingenuous or it just doesn't fit.
So be authentic and know your brand.
Know your brand and recognise that if you go into a dinner party, I think Twitter's often described as the world's biggest dinner party. If you walk into a room, what role do you play in that room? Are you the person that goes in there that is the really amusing person? Are you the person that's in there that tells people long stories? Do you tell them, do you create some value by giving them information? Try to get a sense of what your voice is, because it's going to be a lot easier as a sole operator, as someone who's trying to get the ball rolling, to make sure you can talk with that voice consistently. The second thing is, having established that, choose a channel to start with. I think it's very hard for people to do multi-channel to begin with. You need to build up some confidence, some momentum and a little bit of a community before you start thinking, I'm going to be on all things all the time, because it really is, it consumes a lot of your time. If you're doing it well, it's the reason why there are so many professionals that are doing it, is because the creation of content does take a lot of time. But having a conversation, this is where Twitter's a great one to start with. You can find time to tweet. You can find time on a bus, on a train, in a cab, on the couch. It's not something that requires 2 hours of your day. You can build into it, and then if you find that it's creating some rewards for the business, then it's easier to then put more time into it.
Well, thanks for your time and your stories, Steve. See you at the bar.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks for taking the time to interview me.